QSO Today, Episode 401, Bruce Pryor, N7RR. My thanks to ICOM America for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. There is a sponsors button at the top of the QSO Today website that lists the ways that you can support the podcast while enjoying the services of the sponsors. By clicking on the affiliate link button to get to these sponsors, your purchase there sends a little bit of commission back to QSO Today. Gold Medal Ideas, the business of Amy and Ron Kritzman, make the swag, the hats, the t-shirts, the jackets, and certificates for the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo. They support the QSO Today podcast and the Expo by giving us a small spiff on each purchase. You can support the Expo by buying their products through our store links on the support page. This is the weekend of the Dayton Hamvention. By the time this podcast publishes, there is still half a day, Sunday, left at the Hamvention in Xenia, Ohio. If you see me walking around in my orange windbreaker, please stop and say hello. Bruce Pryor, N7RR, loves to operate SOTA in Washington State's great outdoors, where he has cataloged for SOTA all of the available mountain peaks in the state. I had the great pleasure of spending an afternoon last week with Bruce in Washington, activating Mount Walker in Washington's Olympic Mountain Range. This was my first SOTA activation where I learned the basics of SOTA. This was a great opportunity to get to know my guest in this week's QSO Today. N7RR, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Bruce?
Hi, Eric. N7RR here.
Bruce, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, it started when I was working on my first class badge for Boy Scouts. And the first thing I did was I made a huge mistake. I memorized the dots and dashes of the Morse code. And that slowed me down for years. Maybe I still am suffering from having learned it the wrong way. I managed to get my novice license, and my novice exam was in the home of another ham who lived a long way away from me, actually. So he wasn't my mentor, but he invited me in and showed me his really fancy HRO receiver. This is before transceivers. And eventually, after pleasantries, he said, well, let's do some practice. And so he sent with this beautiful audio. You have to understand that I'd never heard CW properly because my AR3 receiver didn't have a functioning
BFO
on it. And so I thought that Morse code sounded, I didn't know. Beautiful. Like that.
When did you get the first receiver? And why did you have a receiver? Was that from the Boy Scouts, or did you have an interest in shortwave listening even before that?
I don't remember exactly what it was, but I heard about ham radio. And so the first thing I did was I built this Heathkit AR3 and got it going.
I want to go back even further, okay? Because it sounds to me like even before Boy Scouts, you were building a Heathkit?
I don't remember whether I was a scout when I built the Heathkit or not. I just don't remember that.
But to build a Heathkit, even in those days, means you had to have had some interest in electronics to even know how to buy a Heathkit.
I guess that's right.
I want to go back to that first spark that said, you know, I could build some electronic device. What was that? Do you recall? What was it that created this interest for you to even think that you could build an electronic device like a Heathkit receiver?
Well, it's very difficult for me to answer that because nobody in my household knew Ohm's law. So I don't know how I figured out the stuff like soldering irons and so forth. So, and the chronology is kind of fuzzy. But in any case, by mowing enough lawns and delivering enough papers, I was able to buy myself a Heathkit AR3 kit, and I managed to put it together.
Did you have access to electronics books in your school or your public library?
No, I may have, but I'm sure I didn't consult them. I think the way I started was with the Boy Scout stuff. Not even the ham radio merit badge. It was just the first class manual with the Morse code dots and dashes. And I was able to then use the family radio, which had shortwave on it, and there I could hear with no BFO.
And after that, you built the AR3.
The AR3 and the BFO didn't work. So I was clueless. I didn't realize that CW was beautiful. It was not beautiful.
And how did you find the guy that gave you the novice license?
I don't remember how I got his name. All I know is that he lived far enough away in the same town, but a long way, farther than normal bicycle distance, so that I had to beg a ride from one of my parents to go take the test.
What was the hometown?
Bellevue, Washington.
Which is close to where you are now, right?
It's a couple-hour drive. I live almost on the Canadian border in Blaine, Washington.
Obviously, there's some volcanoes that you can see from there, right?
Yes. Mount Baker we can see from Blaine.
I can see Mount Baker from Sequim.
Oh, yes, of course.
It seems to dominate Puget Sound, right?
I've never actually climbed Mount Baker. I've climbed Mount Rainier, Mount Adams, Mount St. Helens before it had its little incident, and lots of other mountains. But I've not actually been on the top of Mount Baker. I've done a little bit of crevasse rescue practice on that mountain.
Okay, so how old were you when you got your novice license?
Well, I would have been in 7th grade.
That's about, 13, 14?
Yeah, something like that.
What year was that?
I was born in 1943, and I was looking at my log this morning, and it was 1957 and 58 was my terminal novice year. I was a terminal novice.
A terminal novice meant that if you didn't upgrade to the next class of license, you lost the license, right?
Exactly. And I was out of amateur radio until I had my first graduate degree.
You let it lapse, I guess, but did you continue to have an interest in electronics and radio even through high school?
No.
So what happened? What did you major in? What was your education in?
I was a liberal arts graduate. Officially, my degree from Linfield College was in German, but I didn't do ham radio in Germany. I spent my junior year in Germany. Didn't do ham radio there. I could have belonged to one of the oldest radio clubs in the world, the Harvard Wireless Club, when I was a graduate school there, but I wasn't into ham radio. So I didn't get to meet all of those people who I'm sure were thoroughly enjoying the Harvard Wireless Club.
So you have a major in German. You did a graduate degree also in German?
No, not in German. I was at the Divinity School at Harvard. And I learned one really important lesson while I was at Harvard. I was late for my Persian class, which was the Divinity School allowed people to take half of their courses outside of the Divinity School. We called it in the yard. And one of my courses was in Persian language. This was after my Peace Corps service in Iran. So I had some background in the Persian language. Anyway, I was late for my Persian class one morning, and I was living in Boston in a slum, a really rowdy place in Boston, but commuting to Cambridge on my bicycle. One morning when I was late for my Persian class, I cut across Harvard Yard, and lo and behold, there was a man suddenly who was wearing a sports coat and a tie. And when I almost hit him, I did not hit him. I came very, very close to creaming Nathan Pusey, who was the president of Harvard University. Now, that could have been the end of my career at that school had I hit him, but I didn't. I apologized and continued on to my Persian class. Most important lesson. And since...
What was that lesson?
The lesson is that bicycles belong on roads. And sidewalks are for pedestrians and wheelchairs.
You could become a very influential politician here in Israel where, for some reason, everyone drives on sidewalks. We have motor vehicles on sidewalks now.
Incredible. And where do bicycles ride in Israel?
They'll ride on the sidewalk as well.
Okay, all right.
Along with electric scooters and electric bikes and everything else. It's quite a hazard.
Well, what that means is that Israel also has not learned that lesson yet.
What did you do as a profession? If you went to divinity school and you were studying Semitic languages and German, then did you end up having a career in the divinity or a career as a biblical scholar or something like that?
I actually intended to study New Testament when I went to Harvard. I wanted to study under Christos Stendhal. And the first semester, the dean of the divinity school died. And Christos Stendhal became dean of Harvard Divinity School, which meant that he wasn't teaching anymore. And everybody else in the New Testament department, I had no interest in. So I didn't study any New Testament course when I was at Harvard. Later, after I did my PhD in geography, I studied mostly on my own New Testament Greek, and I've done some manuscript work in that field. But that's never been a profession. It's just been a kind of a hobby for me. So I read New Testament Greek. I do not read Hebrew.
So there you go. You're just going to have to come here and learn how to read Hebrew.
That's right. And talk it. You see, the big difference is that also at Harvard, I studied Pashto. But Pashto was taught by a German Orientalist, a really fine scholar, an incredible woman. But she didn't speak Pashto. It was just a literature course. So I can read sort of Pashto. That's a major language of Afghanistan. But I don't speak that language at all. My Persian is pretty good. Later, I joined the State Department, and I had more training there. And I spent 2 years in the consular section of the American Embassy in Ankara, Turkey, where I was the Farsi designated consular officer. And that's where I really learned how to speak Farsi. So I'm comfortable with Farsi now. I went on to graduate school and did eventually did my PhD, as I said, in geography.
Did you do that at Harvard as well?
No.
You did the PhD in geography at...
That was at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia, not very far from where I live now.
You really got around with your education.
That's true. That's true. And in fact, I have a couple of stories to tell about ham radio in British Columbia, in case you're interested at some time in our conversation.
Once you graduated with your PhD from Simon Fraser University, what happened after that? Where did your career take you?
I was an academic. I taught at various places. It was after that I decided that I would change from being an academic to joining this State Department. And that on a lark, I just took the Foreign Service exam, and lo and behold, they accepted me. And that's how I got to go to 3 different countries. One was Turkey, where, of course, I was not in Iran because we don't have diplomatic relations there. But I then went to Tajikistan, and the Tajiki language is mutually intelligible with Tehran Farsi, but it's written in the Cyrillic script. So I got along as an administrative officer, not as a consul. Well, I was technically I was a consular officer and an administrative officer in the American Embassy in Dushanbe, Tajikistan. Anyway, I did that for a year. And then after that, I went to Jamaica. They speak English in Jamaica. Beautiful dialect.
They do, yes. British English.
There I was a consular officer as well. And that was the end of my State Department career.
So you weren't in the State Department for a lot of years?
That's right. Only about 4 years.
And what did you do after that?
I retired. I did a bunch of other things. For 1 year, I was a long-haul truck driver. I was a tobacco cessation counselor.
A tobacco cessation counselor is a stop smoking counselor?
Helping people stop smoking, that's right. When I was in Linfield College, a fraternity brother turned me on to pipe smoking. And I thought I would just do it as a lark. I ended up being a pipe smoker for 20 years. Finally, realized that that was not a good idea. And it wasn't until I quit that I realized that I was addicted to nicotine.
Oh, interesting.
Then later I decided to actually get formal training. I trained at the Mayo Clinic in tobacco cessation counseling and was a telephone counselor, talking to clients on the telephone.
So you were living in Minnesota during that period of time as well?
I wasn't. I just went there.
For the training?
Yes. I did my training in Minnesota.
And did you meet our friend Scott Wright, K0MD, at the Mayo Clinic?
No.
Okay, so when did you get back into amateur radio?
Oh, I got back into amateur radio just before my wife accepted a job as a medical doctor in Barrow, Alaska. And so I quickly studied and got my general class license to go there. Eventually got the call sign KL7HLC, Hotel Lima Charlie. And that's where I really got into ham radio, was from Barrow. It's now called Uktiagre. It's not Barrow anymore, and it's a much larger place than it was when I was there. When I was there, it was touch and go whether the ice would retreat enough for a supply boat to come in the summertime.
This was north of the Arctic Circle?
This is way north of the Arctic Circle. It's the northernmost town in the United States.
Oh, amazing.
Right now, with climate change, the Beaufort Sea is open many months of the year, does not have ice on it. And it's never a question of whether ships would be able to get into Barrow. Our world has changed a lot and is especially manifested in the Arctic regions.
And now this message from ICOM America. Field Day is coming on June 26th and 27th, and since it is ham radio's most popular event, you can be a Field Day leader with ICOM. Connect with nature, connect with friends. You will easily cut through the pileups with a powerful and high-quality ICOM base station, the popular ICOM IC705 portable, the ICOM IC7300, and the ICOM IC7610 SDR transceivers are the clear choice for contesters and DXers across the globe. The ICOM IC705 is the perfect transceiver for hams who enjoy both the indoors and the great outdoors on field day. It is the perfect contesting companion because this base station provides features and functionality at the tip of your fingers in a portable package covering HF 6 meters, 2 meters, and 70 centimeters. And it weighs in at just under 2 pounds. Features include a 4.3-inch touchscreen with live band scope and waterfall display, 5 watts with the BP272 battery pack, and 10 watts with a 13.8-volt DC power source. Single sideband CW, AM, FM, as well as full D-Star functionality, micro USB connector, Bluetooth, wireless LAN, and micro SD card slot are all standard equipment, integrated GPS with antenna and GPS logger, and the HM243 speaker microphone is standard equipment. The ICOM IC705 has new accessories now available. The MBF705 desktop stand for just the right viewing angle on your desk, and the AH705 optional automatic antenna tuner that covers 1.8 MHz to 50 MHz bands with a 30-meter or 100-foot or longer wire antenna. The ICOM IC7300 is a high-performance, innovative HF transceiver with a compact design that will far exceed your expectations. This innovative HF transceiver digitizes RF before various receiver stages, reducing the generated inherent noise in different IF stages. This radio changed the way that entry-level HF transceivers are designed. Features include RF direct sampling, 15 discrete bandpass filters, a large 4.3-inch color touchscreen display, real-time spectrum scope, and an SD memory card slot. I have the ICOM IC7300, and it is by far the best HF transceiver that I have ever owned. It is always listening to 20-meter CW while I work. The ICOM IC7610 is the SDR transceiver that every ham wants. This high-performance SDR has the ability to pick out faint signals, in the presence of stronger adjacent signals. The ICOM IC7610 is a direct sampling software-defined radio that has changed the world's definition of an SDR transceiver. Features include, but are not limited to, RF direct sampling system, 110 dB RMDR, independent dual receivers, you can be in two places at once, and dual digicell. For more information, click on the banner ad in this week's show notes page to get to the ICOM America website and its fine line of amazing amateur radios. And when you finally go to buy your next ICOM radio, be sure to tell your dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO. And how was it to live up there where during the summer it's daylight for almost except for 4 hours a day?
For 24 hours a day, yes. This is north of the Arctic Circle. So for most of the summer, even when the sun was below the horizon part of the year, it would still be light. And in the wintertime, at around noon, you could see a little bit of light toward the south. But the sun wasn't above the horizon at that point.
And how was it to live under those conditions?
It was, since my wife was the only doctor in the North Slope of Alaska, we were living in an apartment that was attached through a utilidor, they call it. This is a combination of utility lines and hallway. So she could go to work without putting on her parka. And by that time, we had a very young daughter, Rachel, and I made a point of getting a post office box so that I had to go out every day to get the mail. And the way that Rachel and I traveled there is that she would climb inside my parka, and we would do what was called in Inuktitut tutu. And I'd say, Rachel, let's go tutu. And she would climb in, and she would be in the back of my parka, crawling around, poking through my a little hole in the side of my parka, a little gap in the zipper. And that's the way we got around Barrow. We were there only 1 year.
And what year was that?
I had my Harvard degree by then, and that was in 1980. So it was early in the 80s.
Okay, so you got back into amateur radio early in the 80s.
That's right.
Living up in northern Alaska.
That's right.
That's a pretty amazing story. It's kind of like Northern Exposure was that television show that was very popular about 30 years ago about the one doctor that happened to be up there in that area.
Uh-huh.
I'm sure you have your stories. Okay, so you're back on the air, and then when you leave Alaska, you go back to where? You go back to Washington?
From Alaska to British Columbia. And that's when I began my PhD program at Simon Fraser.
You've already kind of alluded to the fact that while it was difficult to learn CW the Boy Scout way, you actually became quite a CW operator?
Well, I'm not really all that competent. I don't transmit faster than 17 words a minute because I'm not very accurate higher than that. I don't know what my receive capability is. I'm sure 25 words a minute is pretty straightforward. But I never send more than 17 words a minute because I want to send accurately.
Is CW your favorite operating mode?
Yes, absolutely, yeah. I have two fancy keys, both of them Bengali. I have a Bengali Sculpture Mono, which is my favorite key, and another Bengali is called the Leonessa, which is a dual-lever hybrid key, which can be set either as a single-lever paddle or as a dual-lever paddle. And I have that set as a dual-lever paddle. So I can do dual-lever CW without any problem. But I really, really like the Sculpture Mono, which is a honey.
What's the current rig?
My current big rig is the Elecraft K3, but the one that I use mostly is the Elecraft KX2 because I have gotten into SOTA, and now I use that one at home as well. I have a KX3 sitting next to it, but I almost never turn it on. If I need to have higher power or if I wanted to go to 160 meters or 6 meters, I would use my K3. I'm actually thinking about selling my KX3.
Oh, because you have already a portable radio in the KX2.
That's right.
And then you have the base station radio and the K3. What does the antenna array at your QTH look like?
It's a couple of dipoles. Very, very straightforward stuff.
You use an antenna tuner?
Oh, yes.
Now, you said that you have the KX2. It's my understanding that you operate portable, and you've got some pictures actually on your, if we Google Bruce Pryor, we find some pictures of you out on the trail. Are you a SOTA operator?
Yes, I haven't reached SOTA GOAT status yet, but I'm on my way. I'm more than halfway there.
And what does that mean to be a SOTA GOAT?
SOTA GOAT has 1,000 points as an activator. Now, I do have 1,000 points, more than 1,000 points, as a shack sloth.
Or a chaser, right?
That's a chaser, that's right. So I do have that minor honor, but I'm not yet a GOAT. I don't have my horns yet.
Now, it's my understanding that you wrote an article called Backpacking with Pocket-Sized Shortwave Radio.
Something like that, yeah.
I'll have a link to that in the show notes page. But in that article, it appeared to me that there's a certain amount of preparation that you have to do, or that people perhaps should do, and that's why you wrote the article, to take the radios out on the trail, especially if you're doing this by yourself. Why did you write the article, and what are probably the biggest lessons from that article?
Well, I've written a number of articles, so I'm not sure which of the articles that you're talking about. There's the one called Backcountry Communicating, where I talk about the whole range of communicating in the backcountry. And it starts with the 10 essentials, which is something I learned when I was taking formal climbing lessons with the mountaineers in an old theater that doesn't exist anymore in downtown Seattle. And the 10 essentials does not include communicating as one of the essentials. And my proposal is that nutrition and hydration be combined as one essential, with hydration being way more important than nutrition. We can get along for a number of days without any food at all, but we cannot live without water. So what we need is another essential, and that is communicating. And there are a number of ways that you can do that. My favorite way is with a Fox 40 whistle. Fox 40 whistle is a P-less whistle. It was invented by Ron Foxcroft, who was the main official of the Montreal Olympics basketball tournament. And in the gold medal game, he lost control of the game on international television because the P got stuck in his whistle. So Ron then invented a P-less whistle, which combines either two or more tones, which are close enough together that it makes a raucous sound. You know, any mixer produces frequencies which are equal to the sum and the difference of those two frequencies. And so when the two frequencies are very close together, they produce daughter products, which then beat against one another and so forth. And if the frequencies are close enough together, it's extremely dissonant sound. And that really works for blowing, for getting attention in the backcountry. The other one thing is a whistle, a mirror. And signal mirrors have been used by military for a long time. And I still carry a signal mirror with me when I'm in the backcountry. And then, of course, there's radio. Most of this article is promoting amateur radio.
This is the first time I've actually spoken to someone about SOTA. We talked a little bit about carrying Jarman satellite communicators and stuff like this, but I don't recall having a conversation about, these very fundamental things like hydration, for example. Do you have some experience with maybe observing SOTA operators that tend to go to summits without making these preparations?
All I have to do is look in the mirror because I've made those mistakes. I've experienced thirst. I've experienced hypothermia, and I've experienced getting in a place at this point with my 13-year-old son where I was unable to, not only were we out of water at that point, but we were unable to extricate ourselves before dark, and we ended up calling a helicopter. So I've actually been rescued twice. One of them was a hypothermia situation, and the other one was this business with my son.
And how did you notify the authorities that you needed help?
Okay, in the case of the rescue by helicopter, I normally carry a CW rig, but at this point, my son, who's now a ham, was not a ham at that point. We were living in Canada. This is in 1992, and so what I did was I took along a homebrew 80-meter rig, and so the way that I called SOS, in this case on the lower sideband, was to check into a net, a phone net, and the net control operator said, "Is there any emergency traffic?" And I said, "This is VE7 CKF. I have emergency traffic." And he said, "Okay, VE7 CKF has no traffic. Thank you." And then another ham, who's a very famous Canadian, broke in and said, he says he has emergency traffic. And so the net control operator said, "Can you copy him?" He said, "Yes." And I had by this time written out a formal ARRL format message, which was explaining our situation. And I didn't know our latitude and longitude, even though I was a geographer, but I did know a bearing to two obvious places. One was a mountain and the other was a feature down below at sea level. And so I was able to give them that information. And I addressed it simply to the Rescue Coordination Center. And anyway, that message got to the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police office in Coquitlam, British Columbia, I believe it was, and he authorized a helicopter rescue. And then later, I was still on this frequency, I was asked, "Can the helicopter land there?" And I said, "No. There are too many trees around here." And so they then had to launch a military helicopter with a crew of 6, and they dropped a cable down and picked us up.
Was this at night? Was it dark already?
No, it was all during the daytime, thank God.
And so how were you able to signal them that, your exact location when they were overhead if the trees were thick? Did they just see you, or?
They asked me about that, and it happened that my son had a yellow sleeping pad. So we weighted the sleeping pad down off of a rock so that it could be seen above and below.
Oh, wow.
When the helicopter came over, the sleeping pad disappeared. And my son, who had been holding on to his Montreal Expos baseball hat, which was really important to him, and he continued holding that until the sergeant who came down to get him said, "Put your hands down by your side." And as soon as he did that, the Expos hat disappeared. And anyway, Matt went up first, and then I went up. And then the sergeant came down again and picked up our backpacks and sent them up on the cable. And the last thing he did was he grabbed up my antenna, which was the 80-meter antenna, which I was prepared to abandon. And he brought that with him. And when we landed in Vancouver, Matt was presented with a squadron hat from Canadian Forces.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA3ON, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. And do you get an invoice for the rescue? How do they handle an emergency rescue?
Canadian taxpayers paid for.
Well, that's an amazing story. So you've actually had emergency situations, and that has perhaps caused you to spend a lot of time thinking about what's the right stuff to carry into the backwoods when you're going for an afternoon of operating radio.
That's right.
That afternoon could last a lot longer.
That's right. Actually, it was planned as a 5-day backpacking trip. And I had made a navigational error as a geographer. I made what's called a parallel error. I'd been on a trail called the Dilly Dally Trail before, and I knew that the trailhead was right by a 500 kilovolt power pylon, and I picked the wrong pylon. And that's what got us into, you haven't heard much, you don't want to hear the rest of that story before the helicopter came, but it was a difficult situation and big time egg on my geographer face.
But this is before social media, so there was no chance to publicly shame you in front of your geography community.
Absolutely right, yeah.
It didn't even become an article in a magazine.
Yes, it did, actually. It was published in QST Canada.
I'll try to find a reference to the article because I think perhaps we can all learn from other people's mistakes.
November 1992 issue of QST Canada. While we're on that topic, actually, I had one other situation where related to hypothermia. This is in the wintertime, and I went on a snowshoe trip toward the north end of Pitt Lake, which is an unusual lake. It's actually a tidal freshwater lake. At high tide, the Fraser River backs up, and so water then goes through the Pitt River and flows into Pitt Lake. And then at low tide, the Fraser River goes down, and so the Pitt River reverses flow, and it goes back down into the Fraser River. So that's where I was on Pitt Lake. So essentially at sea level. But this was very cold in wintertime. And I was beautifully prepared, even with a sledge, a children's sled, actually, to carry my gear into the high country above Pitt Lake. And then it started to snow. And by the time I had finished one night in the snow, I decided we're getting into avalanche country now. And so I hightailed it back down to Pitt Lake, essentially at sea level. And by the time I was at Pitt Lake, the heavy snow had turned to heavy rain. And I was beautifully prepared for winter conditions. I did not have rain gear with me. And so I was in trouble. And I considered, I got to this place with a rented seaplane. And I had an arrangement to be picked up 5 days later. And realized that I was in bad trouble. I think it was because I was so hypothermic that something happened with my mind. I did not build a fire, and I could have built a fire because I had some gasoline for my camp stove, but I didn't even think about doing that. And but I did have at that point my Argonaut transceiver, which I did not carry up into the high country, but which I had cached down at the lake level. And I had a wire antenna, which I was able to erect not very high off the ground, and tuned around the 20-meter band and heard a single sideband conversation on the Canadian SSB calling frequency, which is 14.140. And it was a woman named Jean Ness in Alberta. And she was talking with a station in Vancouver, which wasn't very far away. I could barely hear the the Vancouver station, but I could hear her beautifully. And I didn't have a microphone along, but I did have a momentary switch, which I was able to use as a Morse code key. So I wrote out, again, as a formal message. And in this case, I broke into their conversation with the da-da-da-da-da, SOS. And she took that traffic. She sent it to the ham in Vancouver, who then got in touch with the float plane company because they knew where I was. And the float plane company came and picked me up. I put together the database for the Summits on the Air program for the state of Washington. We have well over 2,000 SOTA summits in Washington state.
And they should all be following your list of things to take along.
That's right.
You don't make it sound like it's a wonderful time, but I know that you keep doing it, that you're a very active SOTA summiter, and I'm looking forward to doing a summit with you when I'm in Washington State next month. So that should be fun. Let's talk a little bit about a presentation that you made at the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo called Goodbye RST, Hello, Copyability and Strength. Now, we're used to giving an RST when people ask us, what's our signal strength, how do we sound? Why are we saying goodbye to RST? Is that not an efficient and easy way to report someone's signal?
Yes, but it's not accurate. If you actually look at the details of RST, it's all hand waving, general descriptions. See, RST was invented before we had S meters. And once we had S meters, that was a game changer. What happened to RST? It didn't adapt to that at all. Now, and so if you look up RST in any official source, it will give the same system that's been around for a very long time.
What does RST stand for, Bruce?
Readability, strength, and tone. And the readability is, as I say, hand waving. It goes from...
It's very subjective.
Exactly.
It's based on what you're actually hearing out of the speaker in terms of what you think readability is.
That's right. That's the readability part. And the strength is also hand waving. It's its general descriptions. And tone goes back to the time of the transition between to CW from Spark to CW. And at that time, most hams had to manufacture their own power supply. And very often it wasn't properly filtered. So there was a lot of garbage that was on the air. And that was there's a big push to clean up our power supplies. And so that's why the tone parameter of RST has 9 categories. 9 categories. Well, we have clean power supplies now. And a lot of us use batteries. So we don't have any tone problems at all. So RST is almost always ending in 9. In other words, perfect tone. In other words, no power supply problems at all. And so anyway, RST is obsolete. And so I decided it was when I was in the State Department, actually, operating as DX. And often at QRP levels, I got tired of people giving me 599 signal reports after needing repeat after repeat after repeat. And I don't blame operators for that at all. But RST itself needs to be abandoned. We don't need RST anymore. Now, I've actually developed an alternative to RST called Copyability and Strength, and that was published in the 2012 issue of QST magazine. But it hasn't really caught on all that much. I always use Copyability and Strength when I'm on a SOTA summit, and when I'm talking on a voice mode, I won't use Copyability and Strength on the air, but I will record it in my log. And instead, I will give a signal report that says something like, you're 10 over 9 and 10 over 9 and, armchair copy and 10 over 9. Or I'll say, you're 50% copy and S2. In other words, I give the copyability and strength report, but in an informal way.
And do you think that there's some resistance to adopting your method versus RST? Is it because RST is a tradition? It's the way we've always done it, and so therefore we're always going to do it that way?
Exactly. But here's the problem. Many organizations, including the ARRL, have sponsored contests where they require not only signal reports, but RST reports. And that has, and in contesting, it doesn't make sense to have to look at the S meter and, figure it all out. So the idea of using the stereotype signal report has become norm. And people who are writing software for contesting assume that the person's going to give a 5.9 or 5.99 signal report. And in order to record something besides that, you have to punch more buttons in order to get in there and do that. I don't blame those people for doing that, but I do blame the people who sponsor contests for perpetuating RST as a requirement. Most interestingly, the ARRL has now announced the ARRL International Digital Contest, which will be starting in May of this, is that right? Maybe May this year, I think it is. And that one requires one exchange besides call sign, and that is a 4-character Maidenhead grid. Now, that's really useful because it's, first of all, it's very differentiated. I calculated the number of Maidenhead, 4-character Maidenhead grids. It's in the thousands around the world. I just don't remember the figure. And so that's a really useful thing. And I hope that will be a portent for what happens later, in the future for contesting. In other words, that we use something besides required RST for an exchange.
Well, it seems to me that with the microprocessor-based nature of most amateur radio transceivers now, that the ability to push a button while the other guy's talking in order to record readability should be easy. You should be able to come up with a number now or a combination of letters and numbers that say exactly what that means, maybe to the standard that you have on your QRZ page where you've got all of those readability and strength numbers. But it seems to me that this is a laydown now, that if we're listening to somebody and we don't even have to look at an S meter, still is like an analog device, but it seems to me we have all the information now that could even record that into logging systems if you're contesting and stuff. So it doesn't seem to be that this is a big deal technically.
Yeah, that's true. But why bother with signal reports in a fast event like a contest or DXing as well?
Is it because you just want to have something to say?
No, it's just because it's a tradition, and that tradition is old-fashioned, and we need to say literally goodbye to RST. But when I'm on a SOTA summit, it turns out that summits on the air requires signal reports, but does not specify the format of the signal report. And that's why I use copyability and strength when I'm on SOTA summits. And in fact, whenever I'm talking to other people, I say CS. And I've begun doing that now with 2 different traffic nets that I check into regularly. Just this morning, I checked into the Washington State net, and I gave the net control operator CS P6, which means copyability and strength, perfect copy, and S6. That's like perfect armchair copy.
And he knew what you meant.
And she knew what I meant.
She knew what you meant. Okay.
That's right. That was Leslie this morning, who was net control.
We will return to our guests in just a moment. A new way to show your support of the QSO Today podcast is to buy me a coffee. I consume gallons of coffee to create this weekly podcast. Invite me for coffee by pushing the yellow button, Buy Me a Coffee, on the QSO Today show notes page. And now back to our QSO Today. I have a note here to ask you about, have you hiked the Pacific Crest Trail? And what is the Pacific Crest Trail for those of us that even grew up on the West Coast that may not know what that is?
I've hiked on part of the Pacific Crest Trail. The farthest north I got from the Mexican border. It goes from Mexico to Canada along the West Coast. Was Mount San Jacinto. And it happens that is very close to the top of a chairlift, which is not a skiing chairlift. It's a chairlift for tourists who want to go from the desert up into the mountains.
Right above Palm Springs.
That's correct. It happened that there was a Pacific Crest Trail hiker who, in foggy and slippery conditions, fell from the Pacific Crest Trail down below, and he had no way of signaling his distress, and he died. But nobody could find him. A year later, there was a couple who went up that gondola, and without proper gear, went into the wilderness, and they got lost. And they happened to stumble across a makeshift camp, which had been made by that hiker, and found some matches in his backpack. And they lit a forest fire in order to signal their distress. And they were airlifted by helicopter. And 10 days later, or something like that, the body of that original hiker was found.
Which is another guy that went into the wilderness without all the right stuff.
Right.
And maybe the lesson there is also, if there's fog on the trail, maybe it's a good time to just stop for a while and wait till the fog clears, right?
That's right.
Is the Pacific Crest Trail kind of like the Appalachian Trail? You want to start it perhaps in the south end in February and work your way north so that you hopefully hit the northern part of the trail well before winter?
Both of those trails are now recognized as national scenic trails. And yes, that's the way through hikers use them. But those trails are used by many, many people who are not hiking all the way on the trail. I served on the board of the Pacific Northwest Trail Association, which is a voluntary group that looks over the Pacific Northwest National Scenic Trail, which goes from the northeastern corner of Glacier National Park in Montana to the Pacific Coast in the seashore side of the Olympic National Park. And I've hiked a portion of all of the non-Washington part of that trail. I haven't completed the Washington part of it yet, but I've been on many parts of it.
Do you have any plan, perhaps, to do a whole trail, go all the way through?
I think it's part of my history and not part of my future. Day trips are just fine.
They're enough.
There's actually a new development. There's a company, oddly enough, in Rochester, Minnesota, called Hipstar, which is making a pedestrian trailer with two wheels on it, which makes it possible for oldsters like me to carry substantial loads on trails which are, let's say, reasonably well-maintained trails. But it also has a facility so you can convert it into a backpack, so that if you have to crawl over a log or whatever, you can put it on your back as a backpack. But most of the time you can just pull it as a pedestrian trailer. Hipstar, Hipstar. They're not yet available, but they will be probably in a few months.
It seems to me that you could pull a pedestrian trailer. That trailer could have one bicycle wheel or something, perhaps, right? You're on two legs, so you've got that tricycle already made.
There are other pedestrian trailers which use a single wheel, but the problem with those is, and there's one that's made in Germany, for example, that's very well engineered. But the problem with that one wheel is that a lot of what you're doing is trying to keep it balanced all the time. Whereas with two wheels and a properly balanced engineering system, you can, in fact, you want a little bit of weight on your belt for stability, but you don't want to have to lift up the your whole load. So it happens that the hip star is really well designed to actually do that. So I may get back into multi-day hiking when I have my hip star.
And when you do this kind of hiking, do you like to do that alone, or is it a buddy system for you now?
I actually prefer to do it with other people, but in practice, I end up doing it alone quite a lot. Interestingly, my wife, Margaret, K7MWP, is also a hiker, but she hikes faster than I do. So we end up having to communicate by 2-meter handhelds when I'm lagging behind. But I haven't been able to persuade her to go on multi-day hikes.
I have a feeling that Margaret is very similar to my XYL.
Okay.
One day's enough.
She's more sensible than I am.
What excites you the most about what is happening in amateur radio now?
Oh, that's a beautiful question. It's moving way beyond CW, obviously, although I enjoy CW. There are so many new things that people can do with amateur radio. What I would love to do, actually, is to work with some high school kids, putting together a near space balloon. They now have engineered them so that they can, the typical balloon uses a weather balloon, which is latex, and it goes up very high and then pops and then comes back down to Earth. But there are others that are made out of, that are filled with, they're made out of mylar.
They're party balloons, essentially.
Exactly, yes. And those ones don't go quite as high as the latex ones, but they can float, basically go all the way around the Earth using the jet stream. And there's some of them that have circled the Earth multiple times. I would love to be able to do that with some high school kids. And it could be integrated with programs where they study the people and the geography of the places where this balloon is floating. So it could become an interest for the whole school. That's the kind of thing that I would love to do. And also like to help them become general class hams. I've done a little bit of teaching of amateur radio, and I now recommend that almost any teenager or adult can qualify as a general class ham in the United States, or in Canada as a basic with honors license, which enables them to transmit on every amateur radio band. Amateur extra class is for high school students. Those are for the ones who are applying for an elite school. Amateur extra class license doesn't buy you very much. Most of my operating, with one regular exception, is on general class frequencies. That one exception is the British Columbia Emergency Net, which is a CW net, which is actually on the phone frequency of 80 meters in Canada, but it's also an extra class phone frequency for the United States. So I check into 3652 kilohertz to check into that net fairly regularly.
You know, I talk to a lot of hams that have an interest in bringing younger people into amateur radio. And what you say is intriguing in terms of working with high school students, maybe on a balloon project. But it doesn't seem to me that there's a lot of opportunity for that. Or if there is opportunity, that opportunity is perhaps barred by regulation, by security, by whatever those things are. Do you have a prescription, perhaps, if that's the right word, for kind of getting around those barriers in order to create that opportunity? Are you part of an organization in your area or the radio club in your area that has been successful getting to those venues where those potential hams are?
I would say the key is to recruit one teacher. And before even attempting to teach the students, to require that one teacher to become a general class ham. Once that happens, then all sorts of expertise can be brought in, and the students will be able to join. I taught a middle school math champs class. And it was being taught by their physical education is really, really great and really, really good. But this was taught by a physical education teacher, and she did not take the opportunity to get herself a license. And so there was no support at all, even from the teacher who's nominally in charge of the class, to do it. And half of the students got their technician license. One got his general class license. And that was touted as a great success. And I considered that to be an abject failure, that half of the students in that fancy class, that math champs class, these are students who compete at the state level in mathematics, failed to get even their technician license. So now I'm a little, and also I'm recommending that people not try to teach the course as an instructor right there. Kids are adapted to the internet. The best program I know of is Hamtest Online, HAMTESTONLINE, Hamtest Online. That's a very well configured program, which helps people do one thing, and that is to learn enough of the questions in a given exam so that they can pass the exam. Remember that in the United States, to get a ham license, you only have to have 74% on the exam. And in Canada, if you take the basic exam and you score 80% or higher, you're called basic with honors, spelled with an O-U-R. And that one allows them to transmit on all amateur radio bands, but they have to use commercial equipment. So Canada has Canada, I think, would be even better than the United States for having school programs.
But do you think that, and I think that we have this conversation a lot in the amateur radio industry, and that is, are we relevant to young people? You cite that perhaps half the kids in that math champs class were not interested in amateur radio. Perhaps they didn't see the relevance of it. They didn't see the opportunity in it.
You know, sitting here now, I really think that the opportunities in amateur radio are huge. So many things that you can do in amateur radio besides contesting and sending that's boring. Unless I'm just thinking about my novice time. I only had 2 contacts outside of the state, and 3 contacts outside of the state of Washington. 2 were in British Columbia. One of them was in northern British Columbia, and another one was in South Carolina or something on 21 megahertz. That was thrilling for me with very basic equipment. But now there are so many things that people can do in amateur radio that don't have to do with contesting. And, and so it's a question of identifying those kinds of things and getting people excited about that.
What advice would you give to new returning hams to the hobby?
New or returning or?
Well, I guess there are people who are brand new to the hobby. Those people tend to be older now. They tend to be in their 30s and 40s as new hams. And then there are many of us who, like you, became interested in ham radio, maybe were active for a while, and then our life got in the way, and we kind of had this Rip Van Winkle experience where we're out of ham radio for maybe 20 years, and then we come back, and all of a sudden everything's changed.
That's right.
I kind of usually group that question as one question, but perhaps the advice to a new ham would be different than advice to a returning ham. Maybe not. Do you have advice that you'd give to someone who's come into ham radio now in order to find success?
I would say it has to do with thinking outside the box and doing things in amateur radio which are not necessarily traditional. Obviously, a lot of people get into amateur radio because of their interest in emergency communications. And that's important and has been important in my life. But what's really neat about amateur radio is that it can be fun. And so inventing things for yourself and for other people which are fun is the way that we sell it.
Well, I think that's a good idea. I think it's an interesting approach. I hope that if we don't have fun, we probably won't keep doing it. I think that's a great idea. Bruce, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. I really appreciate your taking the time to come on with me and talk to me about your ham radio story. 73.
It's an honor, Eric, and I want to thank you for the service you provide with your podcast, but most especially for your annual...
Biannual.
Oh, biannual. So I don't...
The QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo coming in September.
Anyway, that's a very important service for amateur radio. Keep it up.
Thank you so much. That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Bruce. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put an N7RR in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to ICOM America for its support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of ICOM America by clicking on their banner in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any other episode into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 400. QSO Today is now available in the iHeart Radio, Spotify, YouTube, and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use the Amazon Echo and say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." My thanks to Ben Bresky, who edits every single show and allows both this host and my guest to sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.